From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom right here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis for another little bit of a discussion about the things that are going on in our city. And today, a conundrum that's faced by probably every big city. How do you promote economic growth without hurting people who have very low or perhaps even no income? How can you make improvements to your city that attract fresh thinking, probably younger people, without pushing out the folks who've been living here for years in low-income areas? It's usually called gentrification, but gentrification can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people in a lot of different parts of the city. You build a nice new amenity like the 606, let's say, that runs adjacent to some reasonably stable but decidedly low-income housing. And it's not surprising that wealthier people are going to want to suddenly start buying those buildings and knocking them down to build plush new enclaves. You build big shiny apartment blocks on vacant lots near hardly used L stops, and then when they fill up with young people who live in the world of technology and startups, you get the older, lower income people nearby feeling threatened by them. So what is a city supposed to do? Well, one of Chicago's solutions was to require that every developer who builds a big building include some low-income units in that building. Then the developers convinced the city that it'd be better if maybe they just donated some money instead to a city fund so those low-income units could be built, somewhere else. And now there's an effort to make sure that low-income housing does stay closer to the development, but the people who are losing their homes to rich people along the 606 and rapidly gentrifying areas like, say, Obama land maybe in the future, they're saying, hey, this plan doesn't help us at all. It doesn't really provide affordable housing for families in these areas either. Well, all of these dramas are being played out in one gigantic swath of the city that starts out west along the Green Line and ends up all the way up at, Six Corners, Irving Park in Milwaukee. And we're going to be talking about that today in, I hope, some granular detail with somebody who knows a lot about housing in Chicago. I'm referring, of course, to our guest here from the Chicago Rehab Network, Kevin Jackson, joining us for the first time. So happy to have you here today. I don't know if you would even, you're welcome. I don't know if you would even agree with the premise that I laid out there, but I do think that we are not alone in having this conundrum of we want to have new and fresh people coming into the city, but we want to protect the people who've been here for a long time. And this is one of the things that I guess you guys focus on. This is what you spend your life focusing on, right?
It's the historic mission of the Chicago Rehab Network. The network is a coalition of nonprofits that have been committed to affordable housing with a focus on community empowerment and development without displacement.
Without displacement?
Without displacement. That's written into the mission, and we've abided by that for 40 years. At the network, we don't touch real estate in terms of the organization. It's our member organizations that are the community development corporations. They're all mission-driven nonprofits that are looking about how do we deal with the disposition of real estate. That's the historical role since the 60s when we saw this incredible disinvestment, which, by the way, one of our strong members who's been a leader in this conversation in Chicago for generation has always wanted to remind people gentrification always is preceded by disinvestment.
Absolutely.
And that's a really
Such an important
point about how we think and deal with real estate and what matters. Because when the market moves, it moves quick, as we're seeing across the city, and it invests with the notion of what kind of profit will follow this
And where do you get the biggest profit? In places that have been disinvested.
That's right.
Because you can pick them up cheap.
And there's other risks that people take. It's a huge area of development finance. It's a whole field to itself. And the affordable housing piece is a particular niche that's where we come in at the Rehab Network, is we try to support what are the nonprofits doing out in neighborhoods that exist of trying to help and be a part of those communities for the long term. And that's where we look at what are the public policies that are needed to advance affordable housing? What are the resources that are needed? What's the capacity building and training? How do we aid the field to strengthen itself to be competitive, actually? Because we want to see investment. That's the fundamental issue of all of
Yeah.
us. We want investment, but we want it to make sure that it benefits people who live in these neighborhoods as well. And as your introduction points out, we have very competing forces across large parts of the city, if not the entire city
Of course.
today,
Yeah.
that are looking at, what the market will maintain or risk doing, as opposed to people that are on fixed or limited incomes.
Yeah.
And that's the real challenge out there.
Well, we should point out, this is as good a time as any to point it out, that you guys just recently put out, you do reports all the time. It's what you do. You make reports. But your latest report is an analysis of the second quarter 27 housing in Chicago. And I pulled a couple of things that I thought were particularly interesting, which, well, let's put these numbers on the tables first. Households with income of over $75,000 grew in Chicago. We talk about we're losing population, but those households grew by 100,000 people in the last couple of years, right?
Correct. And the growth of that was significant, one of the leading indicators of what was happening in Chicago's population based on the census. And so our data was looking at what happened in 2000 to 2010. And what we saw in Chicago, as in many cities in America, is what's referred to as hollowing out of the middle class.
Right, right.
So those people that are making around the $50,000, dollars, that's 48,000 is where the city of Chicago was at in 2010.
That'll be like their average
the AMI,
median,
right?
median
Their average
income.
median income. And that group of people, we lost over 20%.
Yeah.
And it's actually 4 quadrants. You look at what's the lowest 25%, then that's 0 to 25,000, 25,000 to 50, and 50 to 75, and your point, the 75,000 highest. Those are the barometers we look at.
So 75K plus, that grew by 100,000. And then right there, just a few paragraphs later, you say the number of households, and again, I know we're dealing with a lot of numbers, very difficult to do on television or radio because it's hard to follow, but just follow with us on this for a moment here. The number of households that are paying more than 30% toward their mortgages. So these are people who own a bungalow or something and they're paying mortgages. More than 30% of their income goes to mortgage. That number, okay, the number of people in that category increased 78% since 2000. So you've got a few more wealthy people coming in, and you've got people whose wealth is just really slipping, even though they've been here a long time. And they're not getting increases in their wages, but other things are going up, and the percentage they're paying in their mortgage is going up and up all the time. But 78%.
Yeah, it's an incredible increase. It's certainly was an alarming fact that we saw, and we were very concerned with. A couple points that I want to also show how difficult this is that 78% meant that owners in Chicago, for the first time, over half of the city's owners were cost burdened, paying more than 30%.
More than half.
And now renters, more than half. That we've always recognized that with the renting community.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's why we're constantly trying to look at what are the mechanisms that can secure affordable housing.
Yeah, I just want to stop you for a second because sometimes, like I said, it's TV. We have to reinforce this. Half of the people in Chicago who own property, who have a mortgage, are
paying more than 30%.
More than 30% of their income for that mortgage.
And in our community, that's called cost burdened. And we're concerned about cost burdened households. That's a government standard, because once people start spending more than 30, and unfortunately there's more than 100,000 families, largely renters, who spend more than 50% of their income to rent in Cook County.
Right.
That's called very cost burden,
Finish your
extreme
thought.
cost burden.
Before we get to renters, finish your thought about what you were just saying. There's 30% cost burdened you were in the middle of a sentence there, and I wasn't sure what you were going to say.
Well, we recognize the cost burden piece is that housing's foundational. Once you start spending more, you're going to have to make some choices about how your economy and the household's going to be dealt out. And we're thinking about the school choices, daycare choices, medicine, right? Medical costs. These are all issues that are there. Housing's foundational is what the Rehab Network put out over a decade ago that says if you care about educational attainment, if you care about health care, And if you're interested in the economy and the workforce, it starts with people having a safe, decent place to live.
Right.
Because otherwise, there's compromises in the choices that one has to make.
And also, parenthetically, when you're cost burdened, you're not going to replace those gutters, or maybe you're going to wait another year on a bad furnace. And so the value of the house deteriorates. And if for some reason you had to sell it, you're not going to get as much money as the house probably should be worth, and blah, blah, blah. But renters, this is where the real story is, isn't it? Renters. I mean,
Well, it's both. I mean, when you mentioned the 75,000 person, there's that great increase. The unfortunate point that many people have now understood that since the 2010 navigation and unearthing of what happened in Chicago, we talk about, wow, look at the growth of the 75,000. On the other side, when you think about what happened within the African American community, where the city, with its population loss, lost over 200,000 families.
Right.
90% of that was African American.
Yeah.
A huge part of that was those families who made 75,000 or more.
Yeah. Within that cohort of the African American, because they could afford to leave, right?
Yes. And that's the challenge for the city when you start your conversations. How do we attract? At the same time, we can never lose sight about
cultural loss.
How do we invest in our neighborhoods so that we're not seeing loss? So the equal concern about gentrification is also about what is happening when we see deterioration.
Right.
Right? And as you mentioned, people unable to make the improvements. And then, therefore, we need to think about, well, what is the response? And what we were talking about today is there's two major numbers that are happening. On the one, you hear about this incredible influx. And we knew, our report lays out, that the growth of the city in this super loop area, right? It was predicted when we first passed the ARO that the downtown area by 2020 would have 200,000 people living in it. Well, reports earlier this week says it's now 229,000 living there.
Wow.
A full 3 years before we get to 2020.
Yeah.
So that number is just
the
escalating.
super loop.
Yeah. And it's high end.
You mentioned ARO. We better explain what that is, because we're going to probably throw that around a lot on the show today. What's an ARO?
That's called the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, and it was passed. There's several versions of it. It was most recently amended in 2015 to try to make sure we are able to gain more resources for affordable housing and also more units. But let's step back.
Okay.
That's what the
We're going to keep stepping back a lot.
Ordinances on Monday, the ARO pilots that came up. That's so the history of it.
How you doing out there? Are you confused yet?
The history begins in early 2001. There's a whole group of community developers as well as advocates across the city saying, look, gentrification is speeding up exceedingly fast in the city of Chicago. And in fact, in the real estate portfolio in neighborhoods across the country, the idea was you better buy now because the train's already left the station. If you don't buy, you're never going to get in. And it's okay to buy because the market is accelerating so much, even if you're reaching in a couple years, you're going to be glad you reached.
Yeah.
And then it all collapsed.
And that was prior to 08.
Yes.
Right.
But in that milieu, the ARO was advocated for, and it said there should be inclusionary housing. There should be an effort that when there's 10 units or more, and this is the foundation of today's Affordable Requirements Ordinance, when there's 10 units or more, and you are requesting assistance from the city.
If you're proposing to build a building of 10 or more,
and you're asking for zoning change, you're asking for financing, and for the city to be involved, there is now a requirement to meet an affordable housing provision. And that historically has been done. Either you can build on site, 2 units for every 10, or you could pay into an in lieu of fund of $100,000. And now that was changed in the amendments of 2015 to make it more realistic to what real estate costs. Because everyone was going for the $100,000 payout, the in lieu of fee, because it was just a smart, economic decision.
So I'm a developer, I'm coming in, I'm getting some help from the city, I'm building 100 units. I would have to build, 20? Would that be right?
It's
I mean,
I want to say, for
number.
sake of discussion,
Yeah.
it's 20. It
Yeah.
depends on what type of assistance. It could
Because
be
that's what
10%.
lawyers are for.
Exactly. You have to have your attorneys
your
on
lawyer
this
can
stuff.
get it down to 17. Right. But anyway, I'm supposed to build like 20 of these things, but I could also just kick $2 million into the fund and then walk away from that responsibility. I don't have to care about it anymore.
Well, you met the responsibility, right?
Right.
By
I know,
doing
but
the
I
fund.
mean, but I don't have to have these. I don't have to have these affordable housing units in my building. They can be somewhere else.
That's the system that exists. And then with the amendments, what they said is build on site or
Yeah.
within a 2-mile radius.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of moving parts to this, and it represents just the importance of getting affordable housing in our city today. It's the foundation to your opening question. How do you invite
How
and
do you
grow
do it?
to a global city?
Right.
Well, you have to think about anti-displacement strategies. Right?
Right,
That's why we were very supportive of the city announcing, and Alderman Moreno and Alderman Burnett, about these new pilot ordinances, because it's the first time, Ken, that we've ever heard the city speak about how do we prevent displacement.
Okay. Bookmark. Stop here for a moment. Now let's move to last Monday. Well, actually, it was a few weeks before that. This ordinance was proposed. The pilot ordinance. Now, I happen to have a map right here, and you can explain this while we put it up on the screen. There are, looks like 3 colors here. There's the blue and the pink and the yellow, but it's actually two
Ordinances.
ordinances.
Right.
This is one ordinance and this is another ordinance, right?
Correct.
Okay, so give me a sentence about what this ordinance actually is doing. Well, let's back up even before that. Let's try to explain what the heck this is, all right? This blue part is basically all along Milwaukee Avenue.
Correct.
If you've ever ridden your bike home from downtown along Milwaukee Avenue,
You're never alone.
You know what that is. It's the hipster highway. And over here is one of the most talked about parts of Chicago right now. This is the near north zone. This is Goose Island. This is the former industrial district. This is just a huge controversy that's going on right now about what's going to go on there. Lots of residences might be moving in where Finkel Steel once was and so forth. So that's one part. That's part of the second ordinance. That's the near north zone. And then on near west, we've got basically Fulton Market and the Green Line and all of that incredible. I would be fair to call
Well,
it
it actually even goes
gentrification.
further than that.
Yeah,
The
yeah, it does.
The
It
near
goes way
west goes
further.
out to Garfield Park.
Garfield Park, right.
Right.
Okay.
And-
All right.
and-
That's what we're talking about.
Very dynamic set of circumstances in the real estate market through that. So you asked, what
So,
are these
what was
pilots?
This, what was this pilot? Yeah.
The sense was that we had a mechanism that was generating support resources either on site or in funding for affordable housing, and the leadership of the city, of advocates and community organizations recognizing that this development pattern is at a pace, hyperinflated was the term, that we are going to see incredible displacement if we don't do more. And so the pilots were an effort to say, how can we get more done for affordable housing and capture that growth? That's the whole concept of this affordable requirements ordinance, about how do you include and get a development agenda that has some equity to it, a development agenda for the city that has inclusive strategies, recognizing the disparity of incomes and places in the city. How do you do a development plan that works? So these were pilots that the city wanted to test. And as I said, they did some, we want to congratulate them for trying to get in front or at least respond to this environment now. Could have been done, right? Some of our community leaders were talking about when the 606 wasn't even finished yet. There should be some strategies afoot about not letting this become displacement, because in our fact book at the Chicago Rehab Network, you could look at what happened in Westtown between 2000 and 2010. Incredible amount of change was happening.
Yeah.
Humboldt
that's for
Park,
sure.
Logan Square, all through that area. The numbers were in. Community stakeholders and leaders, are committed to keeping their communities and people that have lived there having a place. That's the goal of the mission of these organizations, is how do you build communities? Of course we want development, but let's not have it displacing people.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that's what these ordinances are
Yeah.
that we're
Help
looking
me,
at that.
help me draw the 606 on this map. This is Humboldt Park right here, right?
Okay.
So it's going to be someplace around, right around in here?
Yeah, suppose it's going to run, right?
Right
to-
around, so
yeah,
like
it's
pretty
just-
much there and down to, that would be Clybourne. So that's pretty much.
Right.
All right, we have a new graphic for you to look at. That's where the 606 is. So the 606
Give or take a
is
block.
almost entirely in the
Correct.
Milwaukee corridor pilot.
Well, and just to keep it going, the idea that I heard recently is to continue the 606 into this new.
All the way
Yeah.
down. Yeah, they want to put the 606
And
all
we've
the
seen
way
this.
through
I
the
mean-
near north and connect it up to the, yeah, okay. All right, but my reason for asking this is there, a couple of days ago we had this committee meeting, and this pilot thing passed unanimously out of the committee, but it was not a kumbaya meeting. There were a lot of dissenting aldermen there. And part of it has to do, I think, with this, well, it has a lot of things, but let's just look at the 606 piece. There are a couple of aldermen who are on the 606. One is Maldonado, right? Alderman Maldonado.
Correct.
And the other one is Proco Joe Moreno.
Correct.
Are those the two? Are those really pretty much the two aldermen who are on the 606? I'm guessing
That
they
sounds
are.
right. Right. They're-
Well, anyway, let me also say, by the way, that I just want to say a word of good hope to Alderman Moreno. He was scheduled to be on our program today and would have been sitting right there, but a few minutes before we started to tape today, his mother was hospitalized, and we hope everything's okay there. We don't have an update on that, but we hope everything's all right. If he were here, we would be asking him these questions, but weeks before this meeting happened, he, Moreno, and Maldonado held another press conference and introduced a different ordinance which would have done something very specific along the 606, right? They wanted a kind of a pilot program of their own. Is that correct?
That is correct. There was an ordinance that was being shaped and proposed and included members of the Rehab Network and other community leaders and advocates about how do we quell the incredible gentrification. Is there a way to make sure that there's property that's going to be available for people of moderate income and the people who live there?
Yeah.
Right? That's the vision of the Rehab Network and its
Exactly.
members, is who benefits from development.
Right.
Because the city is very dynamic, and the real estate patterns historically have been very troubling, particularly for communities, particularly for the African American community, and by virtue Latino communities. Folks talk about the constant displacement of these neighborhoods, and the issue that we recognize is, with that type of real estate activity, people get hurt.
Absolutely.
And that's what we want to do, is how do you get a situation where people have an opportunity, particularly people that we hear across the city talk about having lived in these neighborhoods for so long, and they lived there when they were tough, and they helped keep it stable, and they were the voices in the ears. They don't want to be the ones to have to leave, because now there's an investment interest in it.
Yeah.
That's our challenge.
It's so complicated because, I mean, we all know the stories of the 606 where somebody owns a 4-flat and somebody comes in, buys that 4-flat and turns it into a single family residence of 20,000 square feet, and then later on they can sell it for 1.5 million, and that is, I mean, it's the gold standard for gentrification. It's just exactly what you're talking about with gentrification. So these two aldermen actually proposed something with very, very high fees, right? I mean, I wrote it down somewhere. I think it was here, $300,000. You had to pay a fee of $300,000 if you tore down a single-family home, $450 for a 2-flat, $550 for a 3-flat, and on and all the way up to $150,000 a unit if it's more than 5 units that you're tearing down. But the city just wasn't with it. The city never got with it. There was never even a hearing on that ordinance, as I understand it, right? It just kind of...
I don't recall a hearing, right? And then with this ordinance that came out, that passed on Monday, word was that the city had been trying to develop this for quite a long time. Over a year is what I heard. And at the same time, it's in response, I want to point out, to frequently, very active aldermen as well as community leaders from organizations that are looking at how do we keep our community together?
Yeah,
Who
yeah,
benefits from
yeah,
that, right?
yeah.
And so you're asking what we can do. There are strategies for anti-displacement, Ken, that we can count on. The one thing we have to look at is property taxes. That can disrupt a family household rental property very quickly. So there has to be some thoughtful work on that. The second one that we need to look at is support, subsidy for households that are working today in our city, but that income they earn isn't enough to afford where they are currently living or perhaps elsewhere.
Even though it might have been enough to have afforded it 10 years ago, yeah.
And the third strategy that's so critical, and it's the heart of the Rehab Network's mission, is the nonprofit development community, those mission-based organizations that are there for the long term, trying to figure out, how do we do this? Well, we do this by investing in real estate that's not going to be caught in the speculative market, right? So they're committed to keeping it affordable for the next generation. And that's where all these different strategies come in. There's endless tools and resources. We need more. But at the same time, you also have to ask, who's there to make sure we have a place for our residents today and their children?
Yeah. It's funny. Again, like I said, this gets so complicated because there are so many moving parts to this. But you could imagine, for what it's worth, I lived for 10 years right there on Bloomingdale and Kedzie. When I was a kid, I lived there. And it was, it was not a great neighborhood, and it got considerably worse in years past, and has been obviously gentrifying and growing back now. But if you were someone who bought into that neighborhood, a very, a modest house that you could probably have bought for $10,000 in 1970 or something, and you paid it off, and you've been living there ever since, you could make a killing if you sold it to some millionaire who wanted to build a mansion there, right? You could probably sell that place for $300,000 or something.
Yes,
so there are some
good
people.
profits.
There are some people who. That's what makes this so
such a dynamic conversation.
Complicated, right?
There's plenty of people that like to talk about, well, that's a great thing because look, you could sell. Well, keep in mind, 50% of Chicago rents. So that profit motive for that 50% isn't there.
Right, exactly.
So that's where it starts to hurt. That's where we need to think about what's fair and these type of things. And so there's three things that came up in the hearing that people were concerned about is, what's the ordinance boundaries? Is it capturing the right area? That was one question, right?
Right.
And the second one is the income levels that are going to be served. Right? And the third one is the size of the units. Those were the three pieces. Those are historical, important concerns for people across the city, right? We've always monitored the city. When you said about our report, the Rehab Network does an analysis of the city's progress every quarter in its affordable housing work. We've done that for the last 25 years. It's been the foundation for thinking through together with our stakeholders, our leaders in communities, our elected officials in the city, what's next? What can we do for making sure that the city is being built for all?
Yeah, and of course, that was part of the tension that really seemed to erupt in that committee meeting on Monday, because the argument is being made, and let me see if I can properly represent it here. Okay, so the guy comes in, the developer comes in and wants to build this building, and he's got to kick whatever it is, $20,000 or something into the kitty, right, for the unit that he doesn't build.
Well, it's
$175,000. $175,000. Yeah, okay. All right. Or that developer could build
on site.
Could just put a unit in his building.
Or the other part of it is he could support a unit within a 2-mile radius.
But the point is that developer is not going to have any motivation to build anything more than the smallest possible unit that he can build. And so the real need, and this is one of the critical pieces of this conversation today, real need is for 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom units for families. They're the people who are losing out all over the place. And it doesn't seem to me that this ordinance helps that at all. I mean, they're going to develop a few of these
Yeah,
but not very many.
That's a very important consideration, and there are very competing narratives about this. In the ARO ordinance as it exists, the developer is asked to keep the profile. So whatever that building is, if it's a building of 2 flats, then that's what the replacement or on-site units need to be, is 2 bedrooms. If it's 1 bedroom, so there's...
I mean 2 bedrooms, not 2 flats. You
Right,
meant
2 bedrooms, sorry about that, yeah. Or one, that there's a parallel to the pro forma, the portfolio that they're doing their financing for.
But no developers are building 3-bedroom apartments anymore in Chicago, are they?
It's limited, and there are, some of our members do the 3-bedroom. We've seen that, and it's in the current portfolio of a lot of organizations. There is a challenge about this,
Right.
getting bedroom size. Some developers say that those are even as we know, can document how important it is, they also find they're very hard sometimes to get rented.
And to maintain too, probably. They're probably more difficult to maintain. Yeah.
But we still need it, and we need to figure out what are those kind of strategies that you can get that. And there, we didn't talk about some of the other tools such as co-ops, right? Land trusts. These are things in a dynamic real estate environment. In a city that's hot like Chicago, we have to be asking ourselves, are these going to be useful to make sure there's a place for people of all incomes in our city? And as you mentioned, there's a lot of hot places in real estate right now beyond just this area.
Yeah, and another thing that has a question that's kind of been arising in my mind about this is that it's just so cool right now to be building 70-unit TODs, these transit-oriented development things. I mean, it's the hottest thing to do, right? And developers are so derivative. One does something that succeeds, and then everybody wants to build one, and then you get too many of them. Just same thing. But I'm sorry, I'm ranting here. But we're going to have thousands of these units of these kind of like studio and 1-bedroom buildings.
Right.
And the young people who are loving them right now because they have a bike storage space in the first floor, I'm assuming that they're human and they're normal people, and they will eventually couple up, and they will eventually have children, and they will grow families. And they're going to need something, and I'm afraid they're all going to go to Morton Grove. I mean, congratulations, Morton Grove. Good luck to you. I don't mean anything bad about Morton Grove, but you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's like the city does not appear to be thinking enough ahead to this cohort, this giant cohort that's moving through. You're probably a baby boomer like I am, and I am accustomed to, I lived my entire life being in this wedge that was moving through culture. Everything we did was the most important thing that could be done. And it's only recently that we've had to surrender that to the millennials, and it hurts, but that's what's happening, right? So we're doing everything for this millennial generation, but what we're not doing is thinking 10 or 15 years ahead of this millennial generation.
That's right. I think your prognosis there about what's being built and what's needed is fundamental to be thinking through, and what is the development patterns that have a little more future-oriented foundation for people that want to transition into families or want to have more space. How do we do that? The city has a large footprint that I think we could be thinking more creatively and innovatively on what we should be doing with this. You mentioned the transit-oriented development that is such a strong instigator of development today. It makes sense to everyone, and at the same time, not thinking through, well, what's being developed there does have consequences.
Right. Or what happens in 10 years? What are those buildings going to look like in 20 years? But that's beside the point. Interestingly, you have aldermen like John Arena, whose ward is just up. Here we have this Milwaukee thing. He's like up here. He's like at the edge of the boundary, right? And he's saying, hey, put me in this too. Put my ward into this because I want a piece of this. I want some of this development coming here. I don't know if that makes any sense or what, but it's just, again, one of these highly competitive sorts of situations where you have probably 10 aldermen who are all kind of duking it out right now about what this is going to do for or against them.
Yeah, and we see that ultimately as hopeful and a good thing that it's contested, but at the same time, people are interested in what's happening in their neighborhoods, right? They want to see a neighborhood that they can recognize in the future. You know, you probably are aware of up in Jefferson Park, there's been a lot of challenges and
Yes.
strategies to
We've
trying
talked
to
about that
have
here.
affordable housing.
Yeah.
That type of negativity is legendary, and it's something that we would do well to change.
Yeah.
That's what we'd love to see, is to people recognize affordable housing is just smart investment.
Right,
We hope it gets involved in any type of infrastructure plans, that people recognize that when we invest in affordable housing, we're doing multiple things for our city. We're encouraging other investment. We're getting a place for people that need a place to live. I shared with you the Bureau of Labor statistics that across Cook County, I can say definitively that there's over 1 million jobs today that are actual people working in Cook County that do not have enough wages to them to afford what's called the affordable rent. In the Cook County area,
In Cook County.
the affordable rent, the wage to afford the average cost 2-bedroom in Cook County today is $21 an hour and some cents. There's 1 million jobs that pay less than that 21.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to have an organization of a city, if we're going to have an economy that allows for opportunity for people to actually succeed, we have to start with that. We have to ask, how are they ever going to get out of that cost burden situation? So we need these strategies that encourage investment, that look at how do we gain more resources for affordable housing, and how do we make sure they're long-term, like through the nonprofit owners and developers and the partners that they have in the for-profit community. There are plenty of for-profit developers that are getting this. They recognize that this is something that is a need that we can continue to grow, and that we need to figure out how to keep resources from the state, from the federal government, the county, and the city. The city itself can do more.
Tell me about why it's not more common for a developer who wants to make money, a commercial developer, to say, I'm going to build a building with 42 and 3 flats in it. Why don't they build them? Is it they just can't make money on them? Is that what it is?
That's a great question. I don't have an immediate response. I think that you're right. The cost and getting them supply, the demand for that 3-bedroom in that type of structure is probably not as rapidly taken up as the demand for the 1 to 2.
Well, I mean, that is the marketplace talking to us, I guess. That's that's the market sending us a message. But while we're on that topic, the thing about this ordinance, this new ordinance that is going to be voted on, I should mention, on October 11th, I believe,
Correct.
Right? One of the things that you have to explain to me is AMI, which is we have already talked about that. It's the
Average median.
Average. It's not average median. It's
Income.
Well, anyway, it's the median income of that area. A lot of these new built units that would be built with the funds that the developers are providing, and that's a pretty substantial amount of money. It's millions and millions of dollars, right? A lot of these.
It's been very successful in generating resources, and we are pleased that half of the resources generated into the In Lieu of Fund, it goes into a fund that's called the Affordable Housing Opportunity Fund.
Okay. When developers say, I don't want to put it in my building, I'll give you a check. I'll write you a check.
Right. Half of that goes into the Low Income Housing Trust Fund. And that's a very strong program that the city has, and it's a program that really focuses on serving households that make 30% or less.
30%. So this is
working with the private landlords to do that.
This is the thing
Brilliant program.
that I think kind of helps tie some of this together when you talk about this AMI, because some of the requirements in this pilot zone are allowing 80% or even 90 or 100% of AMI and calling that affordable. right? So, I mean,
That's correct.
what that's saying is, stop me when I roll off the tracks here, but a developer says, I want to build this building, I don't want to put affordable units in my building, here's a check for $1 million, thank you, goodbye. $1 million goes into a fund, somehow or other that fund develops new units somewhere in the city, but you can get one of those affordable units if you are at 100% of AMI, which would
In that
mean-
zone they're talking about.
Yeah, in that zone.
Well, the ARO always, since its inception, has had, on the ownership side, you could go up to 100 and 120. So that's been
But let me
there.
just finish my premise that means that whatever, for two people, that's, I don't know, $80,000 or something, right? Right now, something like that's they're 70 to 80,000. So a young couple with two halfway decent jobs could be at $80,000 and they would still qualify for getting a low income unit, which to me is not the purpose of building a low income unit. I think of building a low income unit for somebody who's earning $20,000 a year. Explain.
Wow. The explanation of that, you're right, that the greatest need is for those households who make down the income levels, those for housing, right, is the people that are making 50% or less of the AMI. There's an interesting context. You're using the 75,000 ballpark figure. That's for the whole metropolitan area. Mm-hmm. It's long been a concern of ours that the city's own AMI is roughly about 48,000. Okay. So that even makes it all the more controversial, if you will, in terms of, well, who's being served.
Right.
And at the same time, I'm hearing from members and leaders across the city, there's recognition that whereas we need to focus on those who need housing the most, that's been the Rehab Network's focus, 60% or less for public resources.
I know you've advocated that it should be
It's
60
in our
or
report.
below. Right.
At the same time, there is a growing recognition that those households between 60 and 80 and 100% in a hyperinflated market like Chicago are equally at risk
They're
of
getting
displacement.
squeezed. Everybody's getting squeezed, right?
And so the notion that there's this recognition of this is perhaps not such a negative thing. Because if we recognize the greater number of people in our society today that actually, if they want to have that American dream of growing and finding opportunity, that it starts with an affordable place, right?
Absolutely.
And if there's growing numbers of people that can't find that affordable start, perhaps that begins the political will, right, and the wherewithal to say we have to do something about this in a way that's sustainable. Yeah. Because we're in a permanent crisis.
Well, and this whole conversation we've had today has, for all of effects and purposes, excluded talk about homeless or the people who are near homeless. I mean, that's a different discussion on a different day.
And our friends in the homeless community, they have all agreed, and people in support of housing, you're right, that is such a fundamental part of our housing fabric and of our community.
Yeah.
And the people in the justice system coming out. These are exceedingly tough challenges, but it begins by having a place that's affordable. You see that in Uptown today.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, there's Uptown, and that's another piece of this discussion that makes everything so complicated between all the aldermen who are quarreling with each other, because you have Alderman Kappelman, who is Uptown, and generally Uptown and around there,
correct,
around Irving Park and so forth. And he's saying, I want in on this. I want some of this money. I want some of this money to come to my ward so that I can build low income or affordable housing in my ward, which I find kind of ironic, since he's been the alderman who, in his, let's just say during his tenure, a lot of affordable units have been lost in his ward. Probably more than he could ever redevelop, no matter how much money you gave him, because we're so often seeing these SROs and so forth just being closed down and turned into more expensive apartments, let's just put it that way. So,
I mean, that was what I started with. You have these two competing numbers that frame kind of residential real estate in Chicago. The hyperinflated, the millennial, this is great, the global city's moving, and also the long-standing neighborhoods that we've seen disinvestment in. And our report opens up with a quote from the Institute of Housing Studies from DePaul University. And it talks about the shortage in Cook County is 200,000. I asked our friend Jeff over there, what's it in the Chicago itself? He's estimated over 100,000, 112,000, I think the number is.
Pause. 100,000 what?
Units, dwelling places. That's the shortage.
That's how many we need.
And then back to their report, Ken, what's so interesting is in this context of the whole Cook County, the two highest affordable gaps are in Washington, the region of Washington Park, Jackson Park, and Woodlawn. That affordable gap, meaning the number of units that are there that are affordable to people, and this demand that's there in the same neighborhoods. Largest gap is
Demand
there.
as opposed to supply.
And then the second largest is in the Rogers Park uptown area.
Interesting.
It's very interesting. And that's part of our report is, yes, this is good that the city's starting to say, let's figure out anti-displacement.
Right.
But we don't want boutique programs for every neighborhood.
Yeah.
We need a plan that says, let's make sure we're not losing people.
I'm guessing that Washington Park thing, a lot of that has to do with Section 8 people who are walking around with Section 8 vouchers and they can't find a single place where they can live, right? There's some of that.
There's some of that.
Yeah.
And also a market that our colleagues down in Woodlawn say it's one of the hottest real estate markets in the city today.
Right. Well, because it's going to be Obama land, right? Everybody wants to invest in that before it goes through the stratosphere.
And there's enough land. There's enough spaces that we can have a place for everyone.
You must know Lee Bay. I mean, we all know Lee Bay.
Right.
Lee Bay has written eloquently about this, taking pictures from his, ride along the IC and saying, it's just so crazy. We're having these fights. Look at this. I can go, there are 18 blocks in a row here where there's one house on the block. What are we doing? Why can't we develop this? Why can't we spread some of this down here? I don't expect you to have the answer for that, but there you are.
Thanks,
Kevin. I've really just thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. We got to pick this up again and do part 2 of this at some point.
That would be great.
I just have this weird feeling that people who are watching this are just sitting there going, what the hell are they talking about? I can't follow this. Well, guess what? You know what? If you wait a day or two, we have this program transcribed, and you'll be able to get the transcription at chicagonewsroom.org, and you can actually read the show, which I think might be a little better than trying to listen to it or watch it. Kevin, it's just been a real pleasure having you here, and I think I'm just going to look here to make sure that there's nothing horrible that we missed out on. I guess not. But Kevin Jackson from the Chicago Rehab Network, a great organization, been around for 45 years or something like that, doing very good work, and I'm just glad that you're out there.
Thanks, Ken. We're glad to be there.
I'm sure you are.
It makes a difference.
Yeah.
It is 40 years.
Yeah.
And it's been the organization among its colleagues and collaborators that have constantly tried to look at what are the strategies for the next generation.
Yeah.
That's a conversation that we can talk about what we did in the 80s for investment strategies, in the 90s, the ARO last decade.
Yeah.
And now we're on to what's going to take to make sure we have a inclusive community agenda.
Okay, so what are the 2 statistics we gave today that are most important? I would pick 78% increase in the number of people who are paying more than 30% toward their mortgages.
That's a staggering number.
That just blows me away.
And
that's half of the people. Again, half the people in Chicago are living in a situation where
it represents the back of the envelope kind of thing that happened in Chicago is we saw this incredible increasing real estate cost.
Yeah.
And income stagnated.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And I think we looked back and saw that the rents in Chicago since the 80s have increased 95%, and the incomes at the same time have only increased 15%.
It's a remarkable thing. But that's not a Chicago story. That's an American story, right?
Right.
I mean, that's what's happened.
Well, the American story that's fascinating, when you mentioned being of the baby boom generation, there was a real attention about affordable housing. Some of it was very negative in its disruption and the urban renewal that people call today urban removal. right? And it's that insensitivity about how are we thinking about who lives here today?
Right.
And we got to get that right. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there was the Housing Act with Truman and the coming home with the GIs is let's make sure housing's affordable for everyone.
Right.
Right? That mentality doesn't exist.
Not anymore.
So we need back to grow that when we recognize the need is so overwhelming.
Yeah.
Let's create housing in the same way we want healthcare for all, we need housing for
I
all.
was just going to say, we're talking about how healthcare is a human right, so is having a place to live, right?
That's right.
Okay, that's it. We got it. We're going to go. We're out of time.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
your
very much,
time.
Kevin. Thanks. I really appreciate it. And you have been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a production of CAN TV right here on CAN TV. We're very proud of that. And we'll be back next week with another program. As I said, you can check this out, this address right here, where you can see this show and all the others. You can watch them. There's hundreds of Chicago newsrooms you can watch. And we'll be back next week with another one. And thank you very much. Bye.